Welcome back to Pod Save the World. I'm Tommy Vietor.
I'm Ben Rhodes.
Ben, I was going to start this by trying to award you the second ever Champion of Freedom Award, which was given from Senator Rick Scott to Donald Trump this weekend, but I forgot my tiny little silver trophy. I left it at home. I apologize.
Yeah. It's like the participation trophies I used to get in like Little League,
I think Dan Pfeiffer called it a fascism participation trophy.
Yeah.
That's very, very, very funny. Why don't we start with Iran? Because last week, teams from the U.S. and Iran were engaged in these indirect talks about getting back into the 2015 JCPOA or Iran nuclear deal. The talks were happening in Vienna. There were representatives from Russia, China, France, Germany, and the UK trying to sort of shepherd them along. And the readout from those talks was basically no big breakthrough, but pretty positive, right? So then things start to get a little dicey. First, there were these reports that Israel attacked an Iranian ship that was connected to the IRGC. Then on Sunday, there was reportedly a major cyber attack on Iran's main nuclear facility at Natanz that may have damaged thousands of centrifuges that Iran uses to enrich nuclear materials. So the Iranians very quickly accused Israel of orchestrating the attack. They said they did it to screw up the talks. Biden's Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, is in Israel right now for meetings and did a public event with Netanyahu on Monday. So today is Tuesday morning. Iran announced that they're going to begin enriching uranium to 60% purity. This enrichment talk could get a little wonky, but the thing listeners need to know is that 90% enriched uranium is considered weapons grade. So, Ben, a lot of movement here. Two questions for you. First, it does seem pretty likely to me that this cyber attack was timed to happen during these talks, but you tell me if you agree or disagree. And then second, what do you make of Secretary Austin having these very public meetings with Bibi Netanyahu in Israel in the wake of a cyber attack that everyone thinks Israel did, that seemingly Israeli officials are taking credit for in the press? Doesn't that kind of make it a little harder for us to engage diplomatically if this stuff's happening?
You think? And first of all, the Israelis have not been, I think we should more than assume Israel did this. They've been doing all the wink kind of confirmations on background and then saying very kind of opaque, tough things in public. And look, this is a big deal to launch a cyber attack at Natanz. First of all, the Iranian response is a significant escalation. So they've not done this before. They've not enriched up to 60% before. So this is a significant ratcheting up of their nuclear escalation. I've seen some of the dead end maximum pressure guys online saying, well, the Iranians would have done that anyway. Well, they haven't done it before. So
right.
There's a cost to this tit for tat escalation. Then on the timing, there's so many overlapping things that make the timing problematic. First, you've had the very high-profile launch of these discussions in Vienna that, by all accounts, went well. Second, you had Lloyd Austin in Israel, right? And so putting him in a really impossible position, because the question is, did the U.S. know about this in advance? You have to think we didn't. So did they just spring this on him? Like, hey, welcome to Israel. We just launched a cyber attack on Natanz. And then third, you have, Israel in its own unsettled political environment because they had an election, not sure who's going to form the next government. And, perhaps this is Netanyahu kind of fluxing in a space that he likes to go to when he's in political danger. So, of course, this makes things more complicated. And people should know, sure, this will set back their Natanz facility, but by a period of months. And meanwhile, if Iran comes back enriching at a higher level, they will have more than made up for the fact that this cyber attack set them back a little bit. And so the whole reason to have a diplomatic deal in the first place is, with these kinds of attacks, you can periodically set back the clock at one Iranian facility or another. But because the Iranians know how to do this, they know how to enrich uranium, they can just set that up somewhere else,
Yeah.
So it's not, I think it's important to make the argument that we want to solve the problem. We don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon, and that this is not the way to do it. And I think that given that Biden has signaled he wants to come back into the deal, for Israel to kind of be taking an action that clearly would suggest, that will be harder, that's laying down a marker.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you sort of preempted my follow-up question, which is I bet there are listeners who are who are sitting here listening to us thinking like, hey, isn't it a good thing that Iran's centrifuges are broken, right? Like, didn't we read news reports about the Obama administration maybe doing similar stuff? Like, what would you say to them about why, a cyber attack isn't the path forward here, and instead it is these negotiations?
Well, because at the end of the day, like we looked at this hard in the Obama years. How I truly believe, I mean, and this is the thing about the opponents of the Iran deal, act like somehow we're on Iran's side in this. Like, no, I want Iran to not have a nuclear weapon for a million reasons. And what are the ways of doing that? Okay, one is these kind of cyber attacks that can target very specifically a certain facility, crash some centrifuges, sent them back. Iran has more than one facility where they enrich uranium, where they can operate centrifuges. And also over time, this incentivizes them to build secret facilities. So you can't solve the problem through cyber attacks. The same thing is also true with military attacks. Our military assessed that even if, you just bombed the heck out of their nuclear facilities, you'd set back their clock basically a year because, then they just need to rebuild their nuclear facilities and plug in the centrifuges again. And if they go, all out to try to dash to a weapon, they can do that quickly. So that leaves a diplomatic deal that essentially puts in place an entire infrastructure of inspections and monitoring regimes where you're verifying that Iran is taking several steps backwards in terms of, they were shipping all their stockpile out of the country. They were not enriching anywhere near to 60%. They were submitting to these types of inspections. That's just a more durable way to solve this problem. I think some people would also say, well, doesn't this help in the negotiation? Like, you set them back and they may be hungrier for a deal. Like, I just don't think that's like, I don't think that that's the way you get something done. I think the Iranians are more likely to escalate in response to this action and then feel like they're trading down from a higher position themselves. So, a lot of uncertainties here, but this is just not the way I'd want to design the diplomacy that it was trying to get back into the nuclear deal.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the Iranians historically have responded and escalated to attacks on them that they perceive. Also, historically, like the most durable efforts to denuclearize a country have been when those countries choose to do so. Otherwise, they can just figure out a way to try it over again.
And one other thing, Tommy, like on the Obama thing, because I and we can't talk about obviously the specifics of stuff that was sensitive at the time. What I will say is I don't think that's the way to solve the problem, right? So I would not support that. But also, there was no existing nuclear deal at that time. There is an existing Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, that they're just trying to return to. In 2009, 10, we were nowhere near that.
Yes, that's a good point. Let's slide over to Iran's neighbor for a bit. So on Tuesday, the Washington Post broke the news that President Biden plans to withdraw all U.S. troops from Afghanistan by September 11th, 2021. That's the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. Biden is expected to officially announce this news on Wednesday, April 14th, so the day this episode comes out. There's currently between 2,500 and 3,500 U.S. troops in Afghanistan, and there's up to 7,000 international, mostly NATO troops. It sounds like Biden's team landed on this withdrawal date in this decision because they know they can't meet the May 1 U.S. troop withdrawal deadline that was negotiated by Trump. But these peace talks that they've been trying to push forward are still going nowhere. So they seem to think that by announcing the September 11th date, they can split the difference. They can delay the withdrawal, which at this point is probably logistically impossible, but not provoke the Taliban into resuming attacks on U.S. forces. Ben, I'm guessing that all these NATO forces will come out shortly after the U.S. forces do because they rely on us for a lot of logistical support. There was a line in this Post story that said that some U.S. counterterrorism assets will be positioned outside of Afghanistan to remain capable of striking extremist groups in the country. I assume that's talking about some sort of drone base nearby. I don't know. So, Ben, I guess my reaction to this news is I am extremely worried about what happens after we withdraw, but that I think this is the right decision. I worry the Taliban could gain territory. I worry about the stability of the Afghan government, but I've also seen no evidence that a continued U.S. presence will help solve those problems. And I've seen some people argue that the U.S. being there actually makes everything worse. Any thoughts from you on this policy decision or the symbolism of trying to tie this withdrawal deadline to the 20th anniversary of 9/11?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, people in, particular progressives should understand that this is like a really big and bold decision by Joe Biden. I mean, yes, Trump set this deadline, but Trump said it like as he was walking out the door, and did not remove all troops. And that's the huge step. The big step is to get to zero troops. So this is not just an extension of Trump. Like, Biden had to be the one to take that decision, and I'm certain that the military was cautioning against it. I'm certain that people were warning, probably correctly, that there's all kinds of negative scenarios that could play out. There will clearly be criticism from parts of the Washington establishment. So this is a pretty big move by Biden. And to me, it suggests that he's willing to go pretty far in challenging certain conventions to try to end these post 9/11 wars. So I think that needs to be fully understood and appreciated. Wherever you come down on it, just that this was a big effing deal. I think, and knowing their thinking, talking to some of them over the periods of time leading up to this, I think that their basic judgment is, look, there's enormous risk leaving in the next few months. There's a risk of Taliban takeover of much of the country. There's a risk of a humanitarian backsliding, obviously. But I think the tragic conclusion that they reached, that I think is likely the right conclusion, is those risks would still be there 6 months from now, 1 year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now. They're frankly the same risks that I heard about when we had these debates at the end of the Obama administration. And I think the symbolism of 9/11 is them saying, after 20 years of this, we have to recognize that there's no perfect end to this. There's no way that we can exit Afghanistan without inviting a significant degree of risk. And again, I think that's a tough call to make. But if you want to end these wars, you're going to be confronted with those types of decisions. And the last thing I'd say is the Afghans that worked with us, the Afghans who built civil society organizations or went back into government or women's rights groups, those are the people, right, that you worry about. And I think whatever we can do, obviously we'll probably continue to subsidize essentially the Afghan security forces with training and arms and financing. But I think whatever diplomatic efforts we can put into trying to protect the gains in certain areas like women's rights has got to be top priority. And in a way, your diplomacy has to only get more intense as you're leaving. You'll never fill the gap of having troops there. But at the end of the day, the critics of this decision have to face the question, well, what were 2,500 U.S. troops going to do anyway? I mean, how were they going to somehow tip the balance of Afghan politics in a way that we've been unable to tip the balance of Afghan politics with even more troops in the past? And I think for Biden, I'm sure what they're also thinking is like, hey, look, we're trying to pass a multi-trillion-dollar bill to rebuild America. This message is we're winding down this war and we're focusing on obviously this massive domestic agenda they're pursuing. And you can see the salience of why they chose the 9/11 date for that.
Yeah. You can also sort of say, look, bin Laden's gone. I mean, the threat from Al-Qaeda and that part of the world is lessened. So, they're not saying mission accomplished. I don't think anyone will say that ever again in history. But certainly, 20 years into it, I think it's hard to figure out why exactly we're still there. I mean, related to the comments you just made about needing to help people in Afghanistan, especially those who have worked with us along the way. There's a related issue is refugees. And I saw, so in February, Biden announced he was going to raise the annual cap on refugee admissions to the U.S. to 125,000 for the fiscal year that starts on October 1st. That's up from a cap of 15,000 at the end of the Trump administration. But I saw this article about how activists are trying to figure out why Biden hasn't yet signed a presidential determination to make it official, because without that official act, the old Trump policies are still in place. I guess it's been 8 weeks since that announcement, and still there's no determination getting signed. Do you have any sense of what might be going on here? Why announce a refugee increase but not sign the paperwork that kind of makes it happen?
Yeah, I don't understand this one. And it's troubling because there have even been refugees who thought that they had kind of flights booked to the U.S. Turned away. So these are human beings caught up in this. And if this is the lowest year of refugee intake, which if the current course continues, Joe Biden will take in less refugees than any president in recent memory. That's completely against the commitment that he made. I can only guess that, it takes time for them to kind of staff up the government and get their people in place, and maybe that connects to this. But I think they need to accelerate this. And I think on Afghanistan, Afghans are probably frustrated, angry at the United States with good reason for the not just 20, but 40 years of our interventions in their politics. And I'm not suggesting that all the Afghans who are now in danger, or have been frankly in danger a lot in recent years, would choose to come to the United States. That said, I think the United States has a moral obligation to basically let in anybody that worked with us, that worked on behalf of the types of values that we were seeking to instill in Afghanistan. I look, don't get me wrong. I hope that people stay, and that there's a pathway for those values to be protected in Afghanistan. I also just think that, as in Iraq and other places, like we do have an extra obligation here to do our part. So there's this global issue with refugees, and then I think they should be looking specifically at what special programs can be put in place if Afghans are in danger, if the security situation deteriorates.
Yeah, agreed. The other area where you're starting to see a lot of frustration from progressives is Yemen. So, the context is, for the last 6 years, and we've talked about this several times, there's been this horrific war in Yemen. One side is led by the Saudis, and at times has been backed by the U.S. The other side is a group called the Houthi rebels, who have received support from Iran. The results are this ongoing fighting and humanitarian disaster for the people of Yemen. The latest estimate from the UN is that 400,000 Yemeni children under 5 could die of starvation this year unless there's an urgent intervention. So in February, President Biden said that the U.S. would end all support for Saudi offensive operations in the war in Yemen. But now 41 progressive members of Congress are asking President Biden to clarify what exactly that means, right? Like, they want to know what support has been cut off. And, Ben, you and I had the same question when we talked about this for the first time. Many of those same members of Congress also want the Biden team to pressure Saudi Arabia to stop blockading a key Yemeni port, because that's preventing ships from delivering fuel. And without fuel, without oil and gas, cars can't transport food, hospitals can't run their equipment, right? It's just like a horrible situation. There was a powerful op-ed in the Washington Post last week by a Yemeni American woman named Imam Salah, who's been on hunger strike since March 29th to protest the Saudi blockade and just generally raise awareness about the war. Ben, the Biden team hadn't responded to that letter from these members of Congress yet. I think it had been 2 or 3 weeks. Members are frustrated. Do you have a sense of what's going on here? I mean, how much leverage do you think the White House has when it comes to trying to force the Saudis to end this blockade? And why not just more clearly lay out this is what stopped when it comes to military support, and this is what's still ongoing?
Yeah, I think they have a lot of leverage because, again, I think the Saudis cannot conduct a lot of basic military actions without some U.S. support. And the Saudis obviously are a huge purchaser of American arms. So I don't know why you couldn't just say, you're cut off unless you stop this. I mean, it's as simple as that. And I don't know why not to do that, because as you point out, there are people who are dying right now because of the lack of humanitarian access. There's, famine risk constantly in Yemen. And so every day that goes on that, some military objective of the Saudis with this blockade is clearly not being met. Do whatever you can to just put this to an end, because even as there may be complexities in negotiating some political settlement in Yemen, the starting point should be humanitarian assistance getting into the country. That's the kind of thing that everybody should be able to get on board with and agree with. And again, I mean, part of what I can only guess at is they're staffing up. I think people don't fully appreciate the extent to which very few Biden political appointees are in place. Now, that said, you have the State Department and the Defense Department. You can still govern effectively, but this too feels like they made a big commitment, and they need to catch up to it.
Yeah, and I would imagine that a lot of the pressure on Mohammed bin Salman is better presented to him behind the scenes through direct channels versus, publicly airing it out in the press. I mean, I'm guessing, but
I was gonna say I wouldn't mind publicly airing it though.
I wouldn't mind it either.
Yeah.
Well, let's air some Saudi grievances while we're here, shall we? So this is my favorite story I read in the news this week. So apparently a documentary is going to air on French TV, like I think this week or next week, called The Savior for Sale, that alleges that a painting called the Salvator Mundi, or Savior of the World, by Leonardo da Vinci, that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman purchased for $450 million in 2017. Apparently, it's a fake. I didn't realize there's fewer than 20 Da Vinci paintings in existence, and that when this one was auctioned, Christie's called it the greatest artistic rediscovery of the last 100 years. Maybe not. But then some experts at the Louvre did an analysis on the painting, and they determined that it was produced in Da Vinci's workshop and then maybe touched up by him, but not produced by Da Vinci himself. They think it was, one of his sort of close assistants. MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, has reportedly been keeping the painting on his 440-foot mega yacht, as one does, because we know that seawater is good for priceless works of art. Apparently, this documentary says that MBS tried to pressure the Louvre into saying the painting was authentic so that he wouldn't be humiliated by the fact that he bought this fraud. The Louvre refused. This has created tensions between Saudi Arabia and France. So I'm not pro art fraud, but, this couldn't have happened to a nicer guy.
I don't know. Every now and then a little art fraud is not a bad thing. I mean, this would make a great movie or like TV series or something. I mean, there's so many things about this. Just the fact that someone would buy a $450 million painting suggests that there's something wrong with the global economy and inequality.
Paging Elizabeth Warren,
Exactly. Where's the wealth tax on MBS here? The kind of vanity of both buying that painting and putting it on a yacht and then trying to squash the Louvre telling people who actually painted it. But I think the only other thing I'd point to is that, addition to everything else, MBS has tried to cultivate, particularly domestically, but also to foreign audiences, like a bit of a veneer of confidence and capability and competence. And this clearly undercuts that, like buying a $450 million fake painting, isn't exactly in line with the idea that you're the modernizer who's going to bring this reform that's going to, let 1,000 flowers bloom in Saudi Arabia. So, you can see why this is kind of a risky thing for him. But to me, it just highlights the absurdity of any system that facilitates a man buying a $450 million fake painting.
You might as well buy some NFT and some video of LeBron dunking and declare that it's somehow authentic. To your point about this would make a great TV show. Have you seen? There's 2 Netflix series that are sort of about art fraud or art heist right now. One is called Made You Look. That's about someone making fraudulent art and selling fake Rothkos and stuff into the market. And then there's another series that just came out called This Is a Robbery, which is about the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist, which is fantastic because, it took place in Boston in the 90s. The accents are unbelievable. The various mob ties and speculation is great. It's just a great, great unsolved mystery. I highly recommend it.
Boston accents mixed with art theft is right up your alley.
Yeah, for me, right. Those are all my rocket zones. Okay, we'll talk to Boston East. We'll talk about Northern Ireland. So for a little over a week.
That's a great transition. That's the best transition we've had in weeks.
Thank you. I guess Boston would be Ireland West, but who's counting?
Yes.
Serious voice now. There's been nightly rioting and violence in Northern Ireland that has led to, I think, dozens of arrests, injured dozens of police officers. And it's created concern that the 23-year-old Good Friday Agreement, which ended decades of fighting in Northern Ireland, could be, unraveling a little bit. So I'll try to explain some of the reasons why, and we can see if we can figure this out. The first is Brexit. So the Unionists, the mostly Protestant part of Northern Ireland's population that wants to remain part of Britain, they feel abandoned by Brexit. They feel insecure about their place in the UK and angry about new border checkpoints. So listeners need to remember that post-Brexit, Ireland remains part of the European Union, but Northern Ireland is part of the UK, which is no longer part of the EU, right? So once Brexit happened, both sides had to figure out how to create some sort of semblance of a border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, when in fact one doesn't exist. You can just hop up one side of the road to the other and you're in the other country. So that the approach they ended up taking has created supply disruptions, shortages of goods in Northern Ireland, and things that you could understand why they would piss people off. The other piece of the puzzle here seems to be COVID. So in June of last year, police in Northern Ireland allowed about 2,000 people to attend a funeral of a former top IRA official. The IRA, for folks who don't know, is a paramilitary group that fought for full Irish independence from Britain. So attendees at this funeral included members of Sinn Féin, which is a political party that represents the Catholics, and at one time was seen as the political wing of the IRA. So obviously a huge funeral in the middle of COVID broke the rules, but the police decided not to prosecute anyone, which when that news came out last week led to unionists feeling like, okay, there's one set of rules for the Catholics and Sinn Féin, and there's another set of rules for Protestant unionists. That seems to have been enough to disrupt this fragile peace agreement, and it led to like a bus getting hijacked, a journalist getting beaten up, Molotov cocktails getting thrown, like general mayhem. So we got Boris Johnson has condemned the violence, so did leaders in Northern Ireland. The violence has mostly been from Protestant communities, and there's concern about essentially retaliation from Catholic communities. So Ben, just a couple thoughts I had as I dug into this. One, the Brexit part of this is not only predictable, but predicted. It's just so frustrating to see it play out. Two, more and more, I'm worried that COVID is going to have like unforeseen harmful geopolitical impacts in ways that we will never see coming, and will have a tail that will be nearly as long as the financial crisis. And this could be an example. Yeah. Yep. And then three, this is just like a random aside, but when you read about the Troubles and you hear about them described, or you hear about like Sunni Shia tensions, it's always described as sectarian in nature. But it really, when you dig into it, this is really about power. It's not about religion. And I think maybe calling it sectarian can sort of mislead us and, could be besides the point. Anyway, that's the background. What do you make of what we've been watching here? And how confident are you that Boris Johnson is the man to solve it?
Well, I think a lot of this is rooted in Brexit, right? Because essentially, as you described, because they didn't put the hard border between Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland, they basically have a customs border between Britain and Northern Ireland. And that's making a lot of people uncomfortable. And it's probably making the unionists feel pretty insecure, And so then any additional event is on top of that insecurity. And, at the same time, the Brexit drive was overwhelmingly English, right? And so keep in mind, right, that even Britain is England, Scotland, Wales, and then Northern Ireland makes the rest of the United Kingdom. And this British nationalism that we've seen is really largely like an English nationalism.
Yeah.
And so if you're Northern Ireland, you're seeing less and less of yourself, in the politics of the country, particularly post-Brexit. Even if you're a Protestant and a unionist, you're again still feeling a little uncertain. So I hope that what the baseline can be is can a full court press be brought to bear by community leaders and by partners like the United States who are involved in the Good Friday agreements, and hopefully by Boris Johnson's government and other political parties and movements in the UK to just not go back to violence here. Like there are some hard issues that have to be worked out around border and the relationship between Ireland and Northern Ireland in a post-Brexit world. But you really hate to see it, devolve in any way, shape, or form to violence, because once there starts to be that kind of reciprocal violence, it's hard to get that back under control.
Yep.
And so, I just hope people kind of take a step back from the brink here. But at the same time, like there's a long-term question that still has to be answered in Northern Ireland about the future politics of the country. But let's do it peacefully.
Yeah, man. And also, like Northern Ireland is not a huge population, but we're talking about I think 3,000, maybe 3,600 people were killed in this violence. I mean, it was really pretty horrific. But yeah, to your broader point, I mean, God, leaders like Boris Johnson or Bibi Netanyahu who just punt hard problems down the road for short-term, political fixes. I mean, they just drive me crazy. Here we are.
Well, and it shows you that there's always secondary effects to this kind of nationalism.
Yes.
If your politics is dependent upon a kind of exclusionary form of nationalism.
Yep.
Like I'm sure Boris Johnson and the Brexit people didn't think that they were that this was part of what they were doing, but it was part of what they were doing because they kind of blew up this delicate, but successful peace effort that was, significantly helped by the fact that Britain was in the EU. So it's yet another reason to bear in mind that nationalism may make for short-term political gain, but in the medium and long term, it tends to cause a lot more harm than good.
Yeah, very well said. Can we talk about football for a second?
The American brand or the
American brand?
Okay, good. I mean, it's a world though vibe on this podcast.
You're right.
But,
You're right.
Yeah.
American football. Now, so I know that no one has any sympathy for New England Patriots fans, especially a Jets fan like yourself.
Yes.
But it's been a rough week / couple of years for us, Ben, because on Monday, Julian Edelman, star wide receiver, announced his retirement. Before that, we had to watch Tom Brady and Gronk win a Super Bowl in Tampa, of all places. So, even though Tom abandoned me and had that weird MAGA dalliance, which I did not love, I still have some love for the guy, right? Like, I grew up with him. I rooted for him for decades. That residual love is why last week I was confused and upset when I looked at my Instagram and I saw that Brady had posted this bizarre pro-Qatar, the country in the Middle East, propaganda video on his account. And so I tried to figure out why. This appears to be Brady's second trip to Qatar. Each trip has included some work for a nonprofit called Best Buddies, which helps people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Now, that is unequivocally, without question, a great cause and good for Tom for supporting the organization. I'm sure his visit probably came with, Qatar cutting a big old check for Best Buddies, right? But it was also a family vacation that they thoroughly documented on social media in ways that promoted Qatar's image. And I would be willing to bet, Ben, that from private jet to hotel to food, it was all expenses paid. I'm guessing here, but I think it's an educated guess. Now, the reason Qatar would want someone like Tom Brady or Giselle to visit is to burnish their image ahead of the 2022 World Cup and to deflect from the fact that Qatar's workforce is mostly foreign and that those workers are often subjected to slave labor-like conditions and that many workers have already died building structures for this World Cup in 2022. This also reminded me when Saudi Arabia paid a bunch of Instagram influencers to come visit them and gave them lavish vacations in the wake of Jamal Khashoggi's murder. But I mean, I guess, the point for Tom and Giselle is don't let rich autocrats use you. And at a minimum, I don't know, Ben, maybe educate yourself a bit before posting literal propaganda videos on the Instagram account. I don't know. The Patriots are going to suck this season, so I don't even know why I brought this up.
I don't know. Well, as someone who's been resentful of Tom Brady for a long time, this was a little less upsetting to me. I have some Qatari friends, but this is a country with a few 100,000 citizens and 2 million expat workers or something. Of all the places you would go in the world to do your charitable work, I don't know that Qatar would be at the top of my list. And yeah, you can't help but look at that and just know that there was some price tag behind it. Tom Brady, I mean, again, people, there are wonderful things I'm sure to do in Qatar, but I mean, the guy could go anywhere. This guy,
they're so rich. I think Giselle's more rich than he is probably.
Yeah, and so the idea that there wasn't some financial component to this trip, I'm sorry, I can't imagine that that's the choice he made, and it's just kind of gross, right? Because there's no problem going, but there's a subtle politics to the message, right? In reading it, countries that are dealing with human rights challenges, the treatment of these foreign workers who are building stadiums at slave labor at times. There's a subtlety to having a huge influencer come and just talk about how wonderful everything is. And I've seen this in other countries. I've seen other influencers, musicians, athletes do this. This is it's a pretty interesting industry, cause you get paid a lot of money. Whether it's the performers, singing at Gaddafi's parties, right? I used to read about that. Right. Or whether it's soccer players partying in Dubai and posting a lot of Instagram about it. I mean,
or a point you've made, or 4-star U.S. generals paid to give a speech in some Gulf country.
Well, so this is the thing, right? So this, on the one hand, it's a free speech world in the sense of if someone can get paid to go do something like that, they can do that. But I think people don't realize how relentless the machinery is, particularly in the Gulf, of essentially rewarding people who say nice things about you. And that has a political purpose behind it. It's not to promote tourism. It's to distort your human rights record and to get negative attention off of other things that are happening in your country. And that, to me, is where it obviously becomes problematic, and more problematic when you're also influencing U.S. foreign policy. But Tom Brady's not doing that, thank God.
Yeah, and I'm sure he would say, they were nice to me. I'm trying to further cultural ties. I get it, but
he'd say, like, they probably made a bunch of charitable donations. They were probably nice people to him and his family. And why is it not their right to essentially have a PR campaign? Because, like, you could argue that America does its own versions of this too. There's just something kind of gross about this influencer space, particularly when, it seems like the purpose is to, like, don't pay attention to the human rights concerns over here. Look at this beautiful Instagram.
Yeah, just, pay your own way, and then maybe post about the cool camel ride, but also post about concerns about the labor and environmental standards for workers building this, 2022 World Cup facility.
Well, yeah, and which athletes, not Tom Brady, but like do in America too here. We're not suggesting like you only single out like Gulf monarchies for criticism, although there's plenty to criticize. But like American athletes use their platform to spotlight injustice in this country. They should. There's no reason they shouldn't do that abroad too.
Absolutely. Okay, Ben. So I combined two major issues that have been on the back burner but are starting to simmer a bit. These could have been our lead stories, but there's just so much going on. So the first is that there's this major buildup of Russian forces on the border of Ukraine. Ukrainian officials say Russia has 41,000 troops at its border with eastern Ukraine and 42,000 more in Crimea, the Ukrainian territory that Russia invaded in 2014. It's a major buildup. It's a major topic at meetings happening, I think, today between the U.S. and NATO NATO officials in Brussels. Secretary of State Tony Blinken and the head of NATO called Russia's actions provocative, and they expressed support for Ukraine, but it's not entirely clear what that means. CNN reported that the U.S. is considering or has already sent warships into the Black Sea to show support for Ukraine and to send a message to Russia. Earlier this morning, the Russians warned the U.S. to essentially butt out, don't send ships. So not great. The second big issue is China and Taiwan. Again, Tony Blinken over the weekend was on Meet the Press. Chuck Todd asked him if the U.S. was prepared to defend Taiwan militarily from China, because Tony is so new at this, he's going to take a hypothetical question and declare war on the Chinese. So Tony expressed concern about these increasingly aggressive actions by China towards Taiwan. He reaffirmed the U.S. commitment to make sure that Taiwan can defend itself and tried to warn China against using force. In response, on Monday, China sent 25 military aircraft into Taiwanese airspace. A lot of people viewed that as, giving the middle finger to the U.S. and the international community. I think, the truth is that China has been, doing a lot of these kind of air incursions on a daily basis for the past several weeks. So, Ben, I lumped these together again because, getting drawn into a military conflict with Russia or China is really the worst case scenario. I'm curious what you make of, both of these escalations, if there's one that worries you most. I guess you could probably argue that, Russia and Ukraine never really stopped fighting after 2014, but it's still a big buildup. China's behavior is not new, right, per se, but it's getting worse. But how do you rank these when you think about, okay, you're in Biden's Situation Room, like these are two problems that are presented to you. Which one is getting attention from you?
Look, I think that the Russia thing worries me a ton because, the one thing we've learned the last decade, right, is don't assume Vladimir Putin won't do the worst thing that you think he might not do, right? He annexed Crimea, invaded a part of eastern Ukraine. I can give you a lot of reasons why I think it'd be crazy for him to invade Ukraine with this mass force, but he may do it because he's Putin and because he thinks he can get away with it, because he thinks he would win that war and he'd, dominate Ukraine and he'd further embarrass the West. And, whatever his reasons are, like they're in line with the direction he's been going. I think the Taiwan thing, it feels like the Chinese obviously are absolutely committed to bringing Taiwan back into the fold, as it were, from their perspective. And Xi Jinping is like the kind of leader that wants to get that done,
Yeah.
That's I've tried to think through this. Like, why would they do this? The time seems to be on their side, but Xi Jinping just kind of seems like the kind of guy who, for history, wants like the big feather in his cap that he did this. Now, the flip side of that is Xi Jinping probably envisions being in power for like 20 more years.
That's true.
So I see this. I don't see the Taiwan one as urgent, but I see it as a real issue that we're going to be spending a lot of time probably talking about in the coming years. I do think, Tommy, just stepping back when I saw this on the outline, Russia massed on the border of Ukraine, saber rattling in the Taiwan Straits, the Iran issue with Israel hitting Natanz and the Iranians potentially ratcheting up the nuclear program, and maybe the risk of an Israeli-Iranian conflict that we get drawn into. Like, those are three like real wars, like real conventional, not counterinsurgencies, not counterterrorism missions. And this bears watching. It makes you uncomfortable to see that many, kind of fault lines where an earthquake could go off. And it does feel a little bit, I usually don't subscribe to the, like, they're testing the new president. It does feel a little bit, though, like, Trump was such a shit show. The U.S. was perceived in decline. Biden comes in and he says, like, we're back, we're back, we're back. It does feel a bit like the Russians and the Chinese, the Iranians and the Israelis, and the Israelis as our friends. I want to be very clear, as I separate them in terms of the tight. They're not an adversary, but they're testing in their own way. Or that's part of what's happening here. And so how Biden manages this, hopefully, obviously trying to avoid conflict, but also trying to avoid things like Russia invading Ukraine, is going to be a huge. Again, I hate to use the word test because in the political press it makes it seem like the US
I get it.
has all the power, but it's going to be something that they're going to have to spend a lot of time thinking about and working on. And it's not easy. I don't envy them that task.
No, I don't envy them either. Did you see, I think it was BuzzFeed also had an interesting piece about how far-right extremists in the U.S. are viewing the conflict in Ukraine as like essentially a war zone where they can gain combat experience and fight with a bunch of neo-Nazi fascists and then bring that training back home to the U.S. So, I'm glad that the American Taliban has a war zone to go to where they can, figure some things out and come back here. That's great for all of us.
Yeah, Ukraine has become this kind of weird laboratory of international everything, right-wing, neo-Nazis and oligarchs and spies and Rudy Giuliani. It's like, if I was Ukrainian, I'd just be like, can you all just get the fuck out of our country? Like just get the hell out of here, man. Like, it's trying to be Ukrainian, Yeah,
it's just a beautiful place. I just want to hang out in Kyiv and be me. That's too bad. Sorry, guys. Sorry, Ukraine. Okay, a couple more things. Let's talk about Facebook for a minute. So there was a great investigation by The Guardian, and they found that Facebook has repeatedly allowed world leaders and politicians to post misinformation or harass political opponents, even after that behavior was identified internally by Facebook. So basically, this report found that Facebook has gotten better about taking action when there's a likelihood of, major media attention around some, inauthentic activity, but it's happy to let things go in a small or non-Western country. So The Guardian's primary source was a former Facebook employee named Sophie Zhang, who said that politicians in places like Honduras, Azerbaijan, the Philippines, Tunisia, many other countries are able to exploit a loophole that allows them to create fake pages and create fake engagement on posts that boost the government, or they can attack their rivals. And look, I think listeners to this show have probably heard us be pretty hard on Facebook at times, express our frustration with the various harms that have been caused by the platform. But even when I'm ranting about them, I usually feel like, okay, I have some empathy for how difficult some of these challenges are, right? Like with a couple billion users. This doesn't feel like one of those cases because it seems like the company is making the choice not to ruffle feathers in, say, Albania or El Salvador or Poland because it's easier not to piss off the government without really pausing to think, okay, how does this broken political discourse harm the people living in those countries? And, you look at some of those countries and they have really gotten pulled way to the far right. They're entering sort of fascist zone, and it really is pretty scary and sucks. So wanted to highlight that one.
Yeah, I think the reason it's worth highlighting and coming back to this is that it suggests that the whole Facebook ethos and model is just to in every way, shape, or form, avoid pissing off like governments and powerful people,
Yes.
which is
Exactly.
a complete recipe for your platform being totally manipulated by governments and powerful people for bad ends. And very real human beings suffer the consequence. They suffer violence. They suffer corruption. This is real stuff. I mean, I remember when I was in reporting on a piece, that I wrote on Burma, I talked to a bunch of activists there, including people who were in the kind of tech sector there. And I've talked about this before, but they said that Facebook had 2 employees in Singapore, like responsible for Burma, and they only traveled there like a couple times a year. But the only reason they traveled there was to check in with the government, just to make sure that the government wasn't upset with them. It wasn't like they were traveling there to check in with civil society and like,
right,
are they ginning up hate campaigns? Like their whole model is kind of keeping governments happy, powerful interests happy. And there's this kind of self-censorship of doing the right thing. And again, if they were just refused to do the right thing, they have to be regulated. That's when industries get regulated. If they are a threat to public health and safety in this country and around the world, they should have the opportunity to take corrective action themselves. But this story points that even when they have mechanisms that they could use, they choose not to use them. And that's why I think the conversation about regulation needs to continue here.
Gotta happen. Let's turn to Uganda before we get some lighter items. So in late February, I interviewed a guy named Bobby Wine for the show. Bobby Wine's a musician turned opposition leader turned presidential candidate. We talked about how Uganda's current president, President Museveni, has rigged the last several elections. He's cracked down on dissent. Unfortunately, things have gotten even worse since that conversation. Bobby Wine is now essentially under house arrest. He says that over 600 of his supporters have been seized off the streets, arrested, in some cases tortured, in some cases murdered. Many of these individuals had been just collecting evidence of vote rigging in the last election, or they were picked up for the crime of wearing a red hat that has been popular among Bobby Wine's supporters. So President Museveni, he's really like a military dictator. He gave a speech recently where he acknowledged arresting 242 people and he acknowledged killing a few, but he said they were all terrorists. And, it's like typical autocratic bullshit. But what really depressed me in reading about this, Ben, was there was some military spokesman who said, yeah, this is the same kind of policing that the U.S. and the U.K. have used, which, our war on terror comes back to bite us over and over again. Folks in the U.S., we should care about this because, one, we care about human rights globally because the U.S. provides Uganda with about $1 billion per year of assistance. And there's no doubt that money is helping fund this crackdown. So I guess I would just say to listeners, read up on this, post about it on social media, call your members of Congress, ask them to speak up because, Bobby was very explicit in our conversation that press attention, especially international press attention, helps him stay safe. So we're going to stay on this issue.
Absolutely. And just bears repeating, it's easy to look at Lukashenko in Belarus and be like, oh, Putin-backed dictator. Or it's easy to look at any number of the autocrats that the Chinese support, Hun Sen in Cambodia. Well, look at Egypt. Look at Uganda. These are among the very largest recipients of American assistance. And I just think that has to change.
Yes.
But for now, I think the best thing we can do is keep attention on this.
Yeah, you have been very consistent on the need to elevate human rights, and I think every day it is proven to be more true. So a couple lighter things. First of all, the worst Secretary of State in history, Mike Pompeo, has become a paid Fox News contributor. Big news. What a shock. He's going to join Kayleigh McEnany, Larry Kudlow, and Lara Trump in the stable of paid Trump administration hacks. One interesting twist on this, Ben. So failed Secretary Mike was supposed to speak at that GOP fundraiser at Mar-a-Lago over the weekend where Trump got the little silver dish, but he canceled at the last minute. I saw some speculation in Huffington Post about whether Pompeo suddenly realized this created an ethics violation with Fox. I don't know. My guess is he doesn't care.
No,
Fox doesn't really care. But are you excited to see more of Mike on Fox?
If I ever achieve the august heights of Secretary of State, I would hope that I'd have something more to show for it than Mike Pompeo, and I'd hope I'd have something else to do other than be a paid contributor to Fox. I say that as a contributor to MSNBC, I know, but I was not the Secretary of State, and I was not contemplating a run for the presidency of the United States. I mean, it just shows you that these people have nowhere to go. I mean, he literally clearly has ambitions to be president of the United States of America.
Yeah.
And it's so telling that the thing you do in Republican politics is go on daytime Fox and like attack, Joe Biden's Iran policy. I mean, it's pathetic.
He's a troll. The other fun thing we saw was, we here at Pod Save the World, we are suckers for a good old-fashioned crazy propaganda video. And the president of Turkmenistan really delivered for us this week. Why don't we roll that clip? There we go. He decided to go for a bike ride. For some reason, he was greeted by hundreds of people in matching track uniforms who were forced to either stand and clap for him in unison or sing songs for him, and then I guess just trail him on his ride. As exciting as that was, I wouldn't recommend it to visit anytime soon. But I don't know, Ben, where does that rank for you when you think about Turkmenistan propaganda versus North Korea? Do they have a little work to do still?
Well, I mean, this is a country where the former dictator renamed the months of the year. I think he named one after his mother. So I kind of got fascinated by this. And then my wife, Anne, went to Turkmenistan and said it was the strangest, beautiful place, very nice people. We should always be clear to separate the people from the absurdities we're talking about. But she said it was fucking weird. I mean, they built a giant Sofitel and nobody was in it. But the government basically paid to have a Sofitel. So that like if 5 people needed rooms, they wanted to have a luxury hotel. It was that kind of thing.
Weird.
It was just kind of weird, gaudy stuff. But yeah, that's keep an eye on Turkmenistan if you indulge in propaganda absurdities.
Yeah, absolutely. Finally, some fun news for Japan. So on Sunday, a guy named Hideki Matsuyama became the first Japanese man to win a major golf tournament when he won the 85th Masters tournament. Matsuyama is a 29-year-old guy. He's now ranked 14th in the world. This is a huge deal for Japan, where golf is very popular and success in sports is like celebrated by the culture. So I've been reading a bunch of profiles of Matsuyama. He sounds like an interesting person, but he's very shy. A recent profile of him noted that he seems to have no hobbies or interest in acquiring them, which was funny to me. And then in 2017, he surprised the press by announcing that he and his wife had a kid when most of the reporters in the room didn't even know he was married. I guess Shinzo Abe made Matsuyama play golf with Abe and Trump when Trump visited Japan in 2017. I know. I hope the impending media attention isn't too overwhelming for him, because the Japanese press is super intense. But I'm very happy for the Japanese people.
I think it's awesome. I love the Japanese people so much, and I remember fondly, as a Met fan, we signed Hideo Nomo. Remember the pitcher who had first success with the Dodgers. And man, I went to games and the Japanese American community came out of the woodwork. And then there were the press coverage of Nomo's games in Japan. You would look up at the press box and there'd be all this Japanese press up there, furiously covering some May Day game that the Mets are in. And they're the worst team probably in the NL East. So I have huge respect.
They opened a bureau in Seattle when Ichiro was there. An entire bureau
I
just
love
to cover
it.
him.
I have so much respect for it. One of their guys or women now, Naomi Osaka is obviously dominating.
Naomi Osaka's awesome.
Tennis. I love how they just get behind it. It's cool to watch.
Sports nationalism is the best nationalism.
It's good nationalism. Fun. Yes, let's
channel it there, right?
Furious sports nationalists.
God, yeah, I'm excited about the Olympics. I know that they're whatever. The ones in Japan are pretty cool, and there's questions about whether Matsuyama might actually be the guy who lights the torch, because he's a huge hero now. So that's very, very cool. I have a quick recommendation for the worldos. I was watching a show on HBO Max the other day called Exterminate All the Brutes. It's by a director named Raoul Peck, and what it seems to be, I'm only one episode in, is kind of a retelling of fairly recent, 500-600 years history, that isn't just told through the perspective of the winners, through the colonizers, through, the people who end up in charge, and is trying to sort of understand what it was like to be a Native American in the U.S. or an innocent person living in the Congo when the Belgians showed up. It twists and turns, and it's this winding, fascinating history that was very cool.
I'll check it out. That sounds good to me.
Thanks to HBO Max for making a bunch of cool stuff, and Netflix too for all these weird art heist shows. I don't know. Any new books for you?
Yeah. So I Tommy, and this could be a tease. for potential future guests, but I've been reading The Committed by Viet Ninh, who like also was the author of The Sympathizer.
Awesome.
Great novel, amazing story, spy novel, a novel about politics, but above all, like just an incredible human story that he tells and an indelible character that he's invented. So that's my current novel right now.
Oh, that's good. I just started Reaganland, which is like the most recent Rick Perlstein, sort of look at the history of conservatism in the U.S. They are big, meaty books. This one I think it's like 800 pages again, but I'm excited about that. I'm also going to read Hunter Biden's memoir because I was listening to his interview on Mark Maron's show, and like I've been a Maron fan for a long time. I probably haven't listened in a couple of years because like other stuff was going on. But like Maron, as someone who's been in recovery for a long time, having this conversation with Hunter Biden about his experience over the last few years in drug use and alcohol abuse was a pretty amazing conversation, and it had a lot more empathy than like any political news reporter would have had. And I don't know, it was just I highly recommend it.
I'll check out that podcast too, because I mean, like, I had that feeling of watching that play out where you're like, dude, this guy's like a human being. Like, I like what is going on with this guy underneath all this politics and attacks and addiction. And it sounds like he exposes that in a pretty raw way, which, I think I have a lot of admiration for, and better to channel his voice into that, than just about anything else he could be doing. I think it's very helpful to other addicts to be able to see that and empathize with it. So definitely worth checking out.
I mean, I just can't imagine losing your brother, who was your best friend, your rock, the person who like got you through everything, having all these substance use problems, and then having the Trump family just be the most vicious, cruel fucking people on the planet who basically thought they could humiliate you and your father out of him ever running in the first place, right? And it's like Don Jr. still makes fun of Hunter on his Instagram every other day for being an addict, as if that's not like a human failing that could happen to every single one of us.
And it's got to be tough having like, okay, your father's this wildly successful politician. Like that's already hard for a lot of people to deal with. Then your brother is this hugely successful political figure. So before you even get into the tragedy, like that's just hard, right? And then you layer on the fact that your brother dies after having lost, your mom. I mean, just the guy's had a lot of cards stacked against him. So it's good to see him out there, trying to channel that in a constructive direction.
Yeah, say your piece. Don't let these other people define you. That's bullshit. Okay, that's it for us this week. But we'll talk to you guys next week.